Welcome to Devotions with Dave. It's Friday, April 24th, 2020, and I'm Dave Michael, the pastor at Stepping Stones Community Church. I'm coming to you from my office at the church building in front of my Space Invaders wall, and I want to share with you a devotion from Philippians chapter 2. This is sort of a continuation from Wednesday's Devotions with Dave. I started with just the first two verses of chapter 2. And in them, Paul makes an appeal to the people of the church of Philippi and says, here are some questions I want to ask you that the answers are obvious. You know, are you encouraged because you're a Christian? You know, do you find any comfort in God's love? You know, is there, do you have compassion for people? Do you feel fellowship in the Spirit when you're around other Christians? If this stuff is true, which we know it is, he says, I've got a challenge for you. I want you to cooperate with people, agree with them, seek unity, and share your love with them. And so that's a pretty tall order. Today, in verses 3 through 11, he goes deeper. And what is that going to look like, and how do we do it? So if you haven't already read Philippians 2, verses 3 through 11, I suggest you do that now before you watch the rest of the video. So he begins in verse 3, and he gives them here's how you do it. Some practical advice, some commands. This is what it means to live this out in your life. And he says, number one, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble. Think of others as better than yourselves. And don't look out just for your own interests, but be interested in others too. Now, all of these things have to do with us being lowered and other people being raised. They have to do with our human struggle with arrogance and pride and selfishness with our own egos. And so these basically are sort of, okay, if all this stuff is true about what God has done for us, how he's transformed and impacted our lives, this is our calling. It's not about you. It's about caring for and loving others. And this is a tall order. And this is what we're called to do. In fact, this is really what will help us the most. Now, the problem, though, is when pressures come in life, oftentimes the opposite happens. We're not humble. When we feel threatened, we challenge. When problems come, we tend to say, well, I'm going to take care of me first and not worry about anybody else. And so I'm concerned that some of the problems with this global pandemic are making many of us think it's all me, I got to take care of me. And so I think this call to love others and put others first is a great challenge during this time. But of course, how do we do that, right? How do we just make that happen? Well, Paul's big answer to that is he says you need to have the same attitude as Jesus, the attitude of Christ. Now, just before I get into what this attitude was, let me tell you, some people mistakenly believe that that our attitudes are just something that happens. Your circumstances and people do things, and then your attitude comes out of that. The reality is we can choose our attitude as an act of our will. It's why two people can go through the same situation. One reacts great, one not so great, because they choose different attitudes. They say, we can say, I'm going to take that same attitude as Christ. And what is that? Well, let me share that with you. There's kind of a poetic section where Paul shares, he was not selfish. He basically gave up his position and became human. It says he emptied himself of his divinity. Jesus was God along with the Father back at the time of creation. But when he became a human, he came to earth and lived his life here. He emptied himself of that divinity. He said, you know what? Even though I'm God, I'm not going to act as if I am. I'm going to be not selfish, but selfless. I'm going to count others more important than myself. And that's why Jesus came, to live, to share God's love, and then to die in our place. He was very humble. Even though he was God, he didn't flaunt it. He was a servant. He cared for people. He thought of others more than himself. We see this all through his ministry. Sometimes he just wanted to get alone and get some rest or teach his disciples, and the crowds would come into him, and he'd just say, okay, I have compassion, I'm going to help you. But we see it most of all in his willingness to die for us, to be killed as a common criminal when he was God himself and guilty of nothing. So, and the irony is, if anyone was deserving to be non-humble or, I'm the greatest kind of attitude, it was Jesus, because he was, but he didn't do that. And so even when he was falsely accused at his trial before his death, he was accused of being an enemy of God, blasphemy, and of being a revolutionary. They said, hey, they say you're the king of the Jews. You're trying to start something. Jesus didn't even answer. He just, he didn't even defend himself. Very, very humble. A great example. And so we're told we need to take that same attitude that Jesus did. Now, what Paul shares at the end of this section, the last few verses, is that he shares that, well, then because of this, Jesus was elevated. Because of his incredible love, his incredible attitude and actions, God elevated Jesus to the highest position. We're told that Jesus is the name above all names. No matter who you name, no matter how great they are, Jesus is above that. And God says, you have the status of the name above all names because of what you've done, because you've willingly sought after love and helping others over yourself. That puts you above all as my son who died for everyone. Powerful. And he says, and not only that, but someday every knee is going to bow before him. And everyone is going to speak the words, Jesus Christ is Lord, because it will be a universal truth in the end that is known. So what does this mean for us? Well, if we're honest, we struggle sometimes being humble. We struggle sometimes putting other people's needs above our own. Sometimes we feel that life is unfair and we need to fight for what we want. And so Jesus' attitude of humbleness, of almost letting people walk over him at times, of seeking after love and concern for others over himself, it's a deep sacrifice. And I want you to know that God sees the sacrifice. Just like Paul was quoting that someday the Father is going to exalt Jesus above everyone else. When we sacrifice for him, God exalts us too. He lifts us up. And the best way he lifts us up is he makes his relationship with us better. There's something about living out a life of service, of living out a life of love towards others, of denying what I want so I can help someone else, that God just, I guess the process, he makes us more holy, more righteous. And as a result of that, we become closer to him, powerful. And, I believe that God is going to bless us for this. Now, it doesn't always happen the same way. You sacrifice your time, doesn't mean you're going to get more time. You sacrifice with your finances, doesn't mean you're going to necessarily get more finances back right away. But you will be blessed by God in powerful ways. I can testify to that. So we all have choices to make. Paul wants us to choose to not be selfish, to seek unity, to seek loving others, to decide what our attitude will be and make it like Christ. And so our response to Philippians 2 is very important, because we're all facing situations in the world right now that make that particularly hard to do. Our world around us seems to be crumbling. I saw something on the news this morning that says they're predicting there could be a famine of what they call biblical proportions in some parts of the world. With the mess up of the supply chain, we're seeing loss of income, failing businesses. Our economy is like it's not been before. And so this causes us to think, well, how am I going to look after myself and my family? It almost pushes us to say, me, me, me. So this is a tough attitude in a time like this. Our government shut down. We've all been asked to make sacrifices for the safeties of others. It's been a great burden. Many are questioning, is it necessary, or how much is necessary? And we all want things to open up again. And these are feelings that make us just want to say, I want to fight against this. And personally, anxiety, fear, stress, depression are growing. I'm watching it happen among people I know. A lot of us are having a hard time adapting to our situation. Many are working from home. Some are almost homeschooling their own kids because they've got to take classes. They got to manage their kids' education through, distance learning, along with trying to do their own job and manage the house. This is a lot of responsibility. And, we don't get to see family and friends. We don't even get to come together and worship as a group. These are hardships. Paul's advice to us is to consider what our relationship with God, what our faith has done for us, how it's impacted us, and then to take on the attitude of Christ. Seek to be sacrificed, be humble, consider others ahead of ourselves, seek unity as much as we can. And so my prayer is that God will help us with this. That's a big responsibility and an important thing for those of us who want to follow Christ with our lives, for us to say, yeah, I got to work on that. I got to do that. Being humble, caring for others above ourselves is not something that comes naturally. It's a supernatural thing as God works in us. But I believe it's something that comes out of, it's a product of our faith. It leads us in that direction. We need to keep the right attitude and take every opportunity we can to do it. So that's my challenge to you through the second part of Philippians chapter 2. And as always, I encourage you to find some way to connect with somebody in the church, to reach out, share some time, share an encouragement. And in the meantime, or until next time, keep the faith, keep social distancing, keep washing your hands. And I just pray the Lord will watch over you. And until next time, this has been Devotions with Dave.